Good day, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. This is episode 71, and we're joined by a heavy hitter. And I mean that a good friend of mine now, Matthew T. Witt. You all probably know him from episodes 31 and 53. So I encourage my audience to go back and watch those episodes 31 and 53. Professor Witt is currently at the University of Laverne in Laverne, California, in public administration. And we've talked about several topics leading up to this third interview that we're having together. But I just want to say welcome back to the show, Professor Witt, and we can't wait to have you engaged in some crazy conversation as we tend to go up on the deep end to some of my listeners. But it's intriguing, and we connect the dots some kind of way. And I believe these two articles are going to connect more dots with the bigger picture. So I want to say welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Kiko. Always a pleasure.
Yes, and before we get started, I want to throw out a couple of ads. Like I was telling Jay Carrico yesterday, I interviewed Jay. Jay's fourth time on the forum, and Matt Witt's third time on the forum. And it's just amazing, these guests that I've had on, great conversations, meaningful conversations to the audience, and just developing connections and rapport. And I want people to take that spirit outside of the forum and sort of apply that to your everyday relationships, if possible. I know it's challenging, especially when you talk about topics as complex as politics, geopolitics, economy, race relations, all different types of government interference, government power, and everything else. But let's try to attempt to bridge those gaps a little bit more, because we're going to need it more than ever in these upcoming years, I believe. And I think some of the content that we're going to discuss today will concord with those findings and sightings that we more or less do here on the forum. But I wanted to say thanks to the listeners. 92 different countries we've reached, all 50 states. And I just want to say that we have some great guests down the road. We have Matthew Witt on today. Tomorrow we have a repeat guest, Jack Rasmus. We have Jared Ball. We have Radhika Desai. We have Norm Finkelstein. We have all these people coming up within the next week and a half. So it's going to be a pretty active period on the forum until Christmas. And so expect that. Subscribe to us for free. There's never going to be a paywall here. And so I just want to encourage people to support independent media. I know you have your favorite politician, your favorite podcaster that you like. You don't have to like me, but if you like what you hear, give us a consideration and subscribe for free. And don't forget, you can't unthink free thought. And so I was telling Matt before the show, these shirts are not for sale yet, but there's a lot of buzz behind them. And we will work on a contract with someone later down the road, but that's really not the interest right now. But just to throw that out, probably will be some t-shirts available probably in February, March of 2024, just so the audience is curious, keep them on their toes a little bit. But I want to ask Mr. Witt, these two articles that we're going to kind of circumvent today with the conversation, from Greta to the Great Reset and the Other Made Black, which we didn't even get to talk about the last time because we got to discussing other matters. I wanted to give a general question to Matt and let him kind of expand and explore his mind some, because these two articles to me are very related, which is crazy. But my overall question is, this couldn't be any more relevant now, from Greta to the Great Reset, making emergencies happen within the context of the Gaza disaster that's happening right now. This continued since the 40s. We already know more or less generally about the history, but I want you to kind of tell us what's on your mind, and then we'll open up the discussion some.
Thank you, Kiko. I want to make one minor correction, although it's an interesting slip. The title is From Greta to the Great Reset, Making Emergencies Work.
Oh, yes, you're right. I got it. So, yes.
Right. But your slip is perfect. Making emergencies happen. As perhaps we will explore today, and I think it certainly is the thin gray line sort of transecting our world in a very high frequency way these last few years under the influence of COVID, regime thinking, and perhaps now the most recent event of its long history with these events in Israel. Yeah, to explore making emergencies happen. There's a fine line between emergencies that are made to happen and emergencies that are capitalized on. And so any, as we were speaking, warming up here before you ran tape, the first rule of sort of legal jurisprudence in the case of, I mean, from contract law to criminal to civil, is who benefits, is answering the question, cui bono, who benefits, related to which is who has the motive and the means. Of course, motive relates to who benefits, and means is who has the capacity to have subverted contract or to have instigated this, that, or the other crime or conspiracy or etc. And whereas this is sort of criminal justice 101, that rubric for differentiating the plausible from the implausible for politics in general is so muddled from the Nord Stream pipeline explosion to the spectacular defense failures of the IDF in the most recent, as it were, breach. I want to say parenthetically, and you've had Norm Finkelstein, and it sounds like you're going to have him again, second to none for his not only his expansive knowledge, encyclopedic knowledge of all things Israel, but his willingness to be soul searching and sort of bring to you his whole person wherever he gets interviewed. I always learn something from him, and really respect this sort of, as it were, the pathos that he inflicts with his comments. But by way of saying, it's so difficult to talk about Israel. You want to say breach of border. Already that's a loaded supposition, the breach, because there's so many reversals when we're talking Israel. There's so many inversions of sort of claims, and there's so many unbrokered bases for fact that where do we begin? So we can get into that as you wish. And as I told you in this sort of pre-game warm-up we had, was catching up with my own news, discovering I thought it was one sort of, in the first rush of news, it was one massive breach. It was actually more than a dozen breaches of the most redundantly policed no man's land in the world currently, and perhaps ever. How could it be? And not only that, but then non-response by credible sources commenting, no response for hours, certainly no substantial response for hours, at least I think 5-6 hours. How is this explicable? One doesn't have to jump all the way to tinfoiled supposition to begin asking questions and making careful distinctions between fact and claim and following up. But again, as I was saying, that doing so, it is, the precincts for doing so are mostly huddled and whispered. And thank heavens for Kiko's forum and other intrepid venues. As I was speaking, the Weinsteins, Brett and his wife, forgive me, but their their Dark Horse podcast is excellent, but there's so many. I'm not here to plug, but there are so many that are useful. I don't know how off track I am at this point. You asked about Greta and the Great Reset, and we just mentioned the slip, because the mind goes right where the claims of fact are so unstable vis-a-vis the evidence that is produced for them. The mind goes to any number of and it should. One thing that I've come to my mind, for what it's worth, maybe we can circle back on this as we talk Greta and we talk The Other Made Black, is the very famous formulation, the Skinner box, based on the, as it were, pioneering, sort of really in some very single-handed ways at the front end, introducing the notion, the school of behavioralism to psychology. And it was B.F. Skinner and the Skinner box, famously where he formulated the delivery of stimulus, punishment, reward, or no stimulus at all, in various schedules for chickens and other animals, rats, and so on, whose response to whose reaction to the stimulus then would be studied very closely broadly under this rubric of behavioralism, that prior to emotions, prior to cognitive anything, there is a hardwired reaction to basic classical conditioners of reward and punishment. So until we can get to the bottom of how sentient organisms are hardwired as such, and mediate that hardwiring with some level of cognition, until we can determine to what extent that hardwiring drives any number of reactions, then we're just making things up, from whatever other levels of psychology to sociology. So it's just making things up. So in the Skinner box, one of the routines that was explored was called superstition. And superstition is produced with a random schedule of reinforcement, so that the rat, the chicken, can't make a clear association between its behavior and the delivery of the reward. So what happens is it mimics whatever was the behavior repetitively, trying to get a reward, but is constantly frustrated doing so. Superstition. And so, right, how is it that we can sort of map that basic conditioning onto the world, onto Homo sapiens? Where does superstition originate? Well, when we cannot make a clear correspondence between what we want and how to get it. We make up how it happens. So we want rain, but we don't know how to get it. So we make up routines, because we associate the routines with having been successful the last time we did them, or being very successful. So we could go farther into that. But for what it's worth, to put a pin in that, to what extent are we being subjected to a Skinner box routine that reinforces superstition, making associations ourselves that are somehow plausible and workable to us, in ways that then become actually and rather surreptitiously reinforced by headlines and news, that follows our superstition, right? That feeds the superstition with more sort of incoherence when you really bore down to it, but for which a superstition response, it must be this, in spite of doubt that could be examined, right, is tailor-made. This feeding of the hysterical presumptions of rain that produce any number of variations on a rain dance. Let us join together in this dance of Hamas did it for this reason. But of course we know, because Hamas is, sort of, that's what they do. It's self-evident that this is who Hamas is and has always been. It's self-evident that who the bad guys are and the good guys are. For that matter, as we get into the other made black and Greta, I wanted to ask you, and if you'd seen Jamie Foxx's remarkable recent film, The Burial.
No, I haven't. I try to avoid movies at all costs. I know it sounds bad. I'm more of a documentarian, but no, I don't watch movies a whole lot. But I watched The Matrix last night because of you again. I watched it. I was like, let me rewatch this movie again because I have an interview tomorrow to my wife. But no, I haven't watched that movie.
So I bring it among other things because of this preamble that we're discussing about the precariousness of facts in a world that's becoming increasingly, as it were, in Orwellian ways, post-factual. Put a pin in that one again. I mean, under artificial intelligence, really, under the influence of artificial intelligence, embodied facts are irrelevant. Facts that are embodied are made essentially irrelevant. So, for whatever that's worth to keep playing around with. The Burial, so Jamie Foxx was the lead producer. It's based on a true story, and the names now will escape me. It's set in, I think, the early 90s. A true story of a funeral home director, owner, operator, who is under extreme pressure to sell his 3 homes to a conglomerate, Vancouver-based conglomerate, death services conglomerate, that is consolidating the industry according to the same old motives. And he's holding on. He's down in Mississippi and Biloxi, I think. And he's, he got in trouble through a loan from a shady, I think it was a shady connection. The connection was not shady as far as he was aware. It was a savings and loan, I believe. And he got this loan. The savings loan was subsequently investigated for fraud. And he didn't know this, certainly not at the time, but he needed that loan to cover arrears for his other business, which was insurance, as it were, right? Funeral insurance. And so he got in trouble and he got behind, and he was facing some serious challenges, and the vulture-like capitalism that was there saw this, was aware of this, somehow on its radar from Vancouver to Biloxi, and made him this offer. And he thought that the offer was solid, that he would sell the homes but keep the insurance. And not only that, but that this conglomerate would not enter the southern Mississippi market for funeral insurance. And he did that. Under the story, it's Tommy Lee Jones. And so they make him older than the guy actually was, I believe, at the time. Actually, he was significantly younger, but they make him as old as Tommy Lee Jones. And he wanted to pass it on to his family. He had picked up the business from his father after he had returned from World War II, almost in a kind of It's a Wonderful Life. The father dies, and who's going to do the business? And in It's a Wonderful Life, he didn't go to the service, right? Jimmy Stewart stayed behind. His brother went to service, but he wanted to have life and adventures, right? But he couldn't because he had to take the business. Similarly. So that's the basic story. All right. Jamie Foxx is a true character, and I forget the name, but of a self-made attorney who does only personal injury. right? But has been spectacularly successful. So he owns his own jet, Wings of Justice, and he's sort of over the top, right? It's over the top, cliched ambulance chasing, inflected by some tropes, right? That are, the splash. He's also a minister, so he's giving sermons on Sundays and doing personal injury Monday to Friday, flying to country, and blinged out. And so I don't know to what extent Jamie Foxx played this over the top, or to what extent, yeah. But here's why I bring it up. It was a long discussion with my partner Elaine about this. What was remarkable about the story, I hope pertinent to our discussion, was, and I suspect Jamie Foxx was very interested in it for this reason, is that what you have is the correspondence of white and black victimization, and a very carefully stitched seam by Fox and the scriptwriter, name escapes me, and the really excellent direction of acting, name escapes me, corresponding this old white guy, sort of, not really particularly established in, certainly not in a legacy of plantation wealth remotely, right? But this white, sort of upwardly mobile, better than middle class, well off, wanting to pass what's left of a right ownership stake threatened by corporate, sort of monopoly capitalism, and not even in the country, sort of Canada, indifferent to all sorts of things that he associates funeral services as being devoted his whole life with standing for. Okay, so it's got that David Goliath component to it, big capital, right? Very like It's a Wonderful Life. This tiny little savings loan, the big bank sort of cannibalizing in vulture-like ways, waiting for a crisis and moving in. All right, so it's that sort of trope narrative. But here, significant maybe for us is, but there's also inflected here the black-white line, and the demystifying of whiteness, blackness, and establishing this strong correspondence in the story and in real life. The attorney first says no for a couple of reasons to the guy who comes to him asking him, and I don't know about the true story, but in the film, at some point these guys met. In the film, that is brokered by a young, very young black attorney. You don't know exactly how he got connected with the funeral home guy, but he says, I want you to think about going to this attorney because he's never lost a case in 12 years. And to which the funeral home director said, but I have an attorney who I've worked with my whole life. No. I know, but you're filing, we're filing this case in this county that's overwhelmingly black, African-American. And how's it going to look having a white attorney come in for a white man arguing he's been the victim here? You have to play to the home crowd. This might be a good idea. So I don't know in the true story how he got with the showboating, ambulance chasing, extremely talented guy, but he did. And when the first meeting that's depicted, the guy says, sorry, I don't have the names. He says, the attorney says, look, what? And it's Jamie Foxx. So it's done with tongue in cheek, every which direction you possibly can at the same time. And what I really like his acting is he takes you right up to the line of the trope, of the caricature. And then he shakes you off it. He takes you right back up to it. Then he shakes you off it again. He keeps taking it. He keeps shaking it off. It's real artistry. And he says, look, well, the thing is, two things. You're white, okay? And this wasn't an accident. There's no injury here. So I don't know why I'm being called it. And it gets around to being explained, but not on the first take. All right. So the young guy comes back and storms the office after they leave and get the hard no. He storms back, and Jimmy Fox is there, and he's got an associate, his right hand man is there making all sorts of funny commentary, sitting, which is ridiculous. And the young guy comes back and says, "Here's the thing, do you want to played a caricature your whole career and your whole life? Because how much money you have, what that character is going to be. You're going to be an ambulance chaser and whatever else fits the trope. You want to be that, or you want to take your winning success and your remarkable talents and step it up a notch." So nominally, the law is contract law. He doesn't do contract law, but he gets it. So the story deepens. The character, he was a sharecropping kid from Generation Sharecropping, made his way up, and et cetera. It's a rags to riches. All right. Thing is, it's based on a true story. Mm-hmm. And they bring down Goliath. So the title of the film, The Burial. Whose burial? What's getting buried? At some point in the film, the National Baptist NBC National Baptist Coalition head of that takes Jimmy Fox and the young attorney to an unmarked mass slave grave site, and points out there's any number of these all over the South, dotted with, in more than one occasion, Civil War monuments. And so you have this literal overriding of one history by another, this erasure of one by another, literally and in the same place through continuous present for as long as those statues shall remain. And so that, right, at a grave moment in the film story, this point is made. So, but the burial, so vague reference, indefinite article. Mm-hmm. I guess a burial would be more indefinite. The burial is more descriptive, but here it's even more elusive because we don't know which burial. Mm-hmm. It's just burial of the CEO who falls from grace catastrophically under cross-examination of this very cagey, gifted, talented, determined lawyer, sharecropping turned lawyer. Is it that burial? Is it the burial of a hatchet between the white establishment, such as it was embodied in the film, and the black sort of nouveau riche arrival coming in as hired guns? Is it is there something else being buried there? Is it the excavation of a burial that has never been interrogated, that has never been plotted, that has never been stratified and bones extracted and archaeologically explained? Is it that burial? How many strata of sediment in this burial? You could go in all sorts of directions. I found the film remarkable in a lot of ways and keyed very much in some ways to our discussion. And for me, in a lot of ways, The Other Made Black. What I tried to do was describe how blackness, whiteness, and that axis, sort of inflected as is by degrees of separation, for which there is no nominal center, because it's all invention. That the interrogation of that has been suspended persistently and continuously, and it's really, when you reduce, in so many better formulations in mind that I shamelessly appropriate for that piece, it's really about othering. And there's any number of sort of worthy names that initiate that discourse, and but in the case of the United States history, blackness was made to order in this particular dynamic of othering, and the mischief that has been produced as a result, and the extraordinary resilience of the trope of blackness, as it were. The ness, the sort of adjectivizing, is useful, because there is no absolute to white or black. These are constructs, and they have constructs that have no basis in genetic anything, none whatsoever. So we, nominally, the most black person you could find by designation, contrived designation, deviates genetically from the most white person you could find by contrived designation no more than does that white person deviate with the other most white person, genetically. You could find people who are related by blood, whose genes differ more between each other than do their genes differ across geography. So what are we really talking about? We are talking singularly about a construct that's been extraordinarily effective in massively reproducing a set of assumptions that are fallacious all the way down. There's all the way down to wherever you could, extract meaningful, informative content, utterly fallacious. There is, nature knows for no race. It doesn't. There's no genetic, and you cannot find it. There are pools of genes. Right? There are pools, nominally, that if they are, for over millennia, have a certain rate of procreation that draws from a relatively excluded domain, you're going to pool certain characteristics. But in human history, at this point, with the migratory patterns of thousands of years, so many of those have been washed out. So many. You do have physiognomy. You have phenotypic attributes, which is really what we're talking about. We're talking about hair type. We're talking about melanin content. We're talking about facial features, bone structures. At the genetic level, these are completely meaningless. Just completely meaningless. So back to what are we really talking about? We're talking about a means of establishing divisions. Mm-hmm. And we're basically talking about introducing a caste structure, a social caste structure, through the back door of a polity devoted to democracy. So again, if we get back to our opening discussion about premises based on fallacy, right? And the startling contradiction. Here is a democracy second to none, under which is a subtext of exclusion based on utter fiction. There's no way to live down that big lie except to persistently keep repeating it. So the more you are nominally devoted to the obverse of the lie, the more you have to double down on the lie. You can then have subroutines, nominally liberal, that worry over these people being harmed and these over here and so on, that just recategorizes the lie. It usually recategorizes it. It's very rare ever that I've heard in sort of popular discourse, we are talking about utter bullshit when we talk race. I mean, show me the interview with the current darling of liberal anything from Democracy Now! To anywhere else that's gonna not to pick on anyone, particularly as about. I don't know that I've ever heard Cornel West come out and say, race is utter bullshit. I don't think I've ever heard Al Sharpton ever once say, we're talking total bullshit. I don't think I've once heard it. And I'm not singling them out as why should they be any more responsible? I'm not. But there it is. So why is it so difficult? Why is it so? Why is it such a forfeited line of attack? Again, under the auspices of a democracy that is second to none in the world ever for all time. There's all sorts of excuses that could be made. All sorts of excuses. And yet, they are excuses. And there's a lot of political capital gained in this area. So conservatives want to refuse that there's racism anywhere, but they don't refuse that there are races. The liberal wants to insist that there's racism, but refuse to say that there's no such thing as race. They make a lot of political capital over that. The conservative hews to the premise that we're a free nation devoted to opportunity and merit, and may the best person be chosen for this or that or the next position, line of credit, and so on. What they refuse to accept or interrogate is the intergenerational consequences of being associated with race. So they always take as de novo the next generation. This, of course, is a cheap deception. It's an absurd deception. It's an absurd sort of, it's an obviously absurd. Yeah? That's why it's an incantation. That which is obviously absurd, repeated often enough, becomes a value. And a constellation of values becomes an ideology. All of it becomes hermetic and impervious to scrutiny, because to challenge it, right, certainly from within the precincts of the loyal opposition, is too threatening. So then the designated opposition clings to its ideological package that's riddled with contradictions, and they both benefit because they both monopolize the exclusion of doubt. That's what they both benefit from. And so back to Jamie Foxx's film, and any number of films that are, I'm going to say, nominally Black produced and so on, yeah, that are from Get Out to whatever. There was another that was so well done a while back. Pardon me for, I can't remember again, a kind of in a sci-fi thriller playing with that genre. It'll maybe come to me. I'm hardly the person to comment on this or that great film, but it influenced me. And so, but Jamie Foxx is clearly sort of there, and the rest of the production team and direction and so on are clearly quarrying in the domain of fudging the line between white and Black, and fudging the whole pretense of Blackness entirely. That it is not a construct that begins with a cheat at some point. And in the case of The Burial, the film, that what's revealed, again, what is revealed is all of the exploitation and double dealing that this corporation had done in Black communities in particular, which is a major source of evidence for the trial. You know, that this was commensurate to what they would do anywhere to anyone, right? So that's because that's what they do. And Bill Camp, the actor, very, very fine actor, a very minimalist actor, plays the part of this guy. And what the attorney Jamie Foxx reveals is this sort of nominally colorblind indifference, but always seizing the opportunity. And where you have poor people, you have even more opportunity. And since there are large clusters of poverty that happen also to be Black, then you could back up and say, well, that's racist. But in the first place, it's opportunity. So it's opportunity simply taking advantage of what is and persistently continues to be. So here we have a nominal division between Marxist and critical race. And what are we really talking about when we talk race? Since it is a fiction, then we have to bore down and ask who benefits or what benefits. And you follow the money and you discover with Occam's razor, what is the simplest answer to a complex question? What answers the question most elegantly and directly, parsimoniously, whatever you want to call it? What does it, right? The Marxists, it's very straightforward. It's the means the axis of production is what explains the opportunity that racializations present. Now, there are others that argue very, very effectively that in some ways, because race emerged as a thing concurrent with capitalism, to what extent capitalism is through and through a racist project, intended to, provisionally under rules of free flow of capital, right, that were worked out over generations from 15 something to where we are, that essentially what they were doing was establishing a gradient of entitlement in the world, and for which there is very interesting and significant arguments and evidence to be procured. That we are now on the brink in this perpetually late capitalism. That Marxists have a difficulty to, well, how late is this capitalism? It's just sort of pinning it down. Really late, super late? What is it like the nuclear clock? How late in the late are we? And to which I think there's a reasonable response that capitalism, in the scheme of things, is a blip. It was actually, looking back, will historians call it neo-feudalism? Mm-hmm. That it was just another stage of mercantilist practices, because the evidence there is quite substantial. We have, as Marx understood, monopoly capital, the tendency towards monopoly. And we certainly are seeing that. And Marx would forecast that capitalism would inevitably collapse under the weight of its contradictions. I'm not the Marx scholar to tell you, did he ever, he saw capitalism as a very clear breach with feudalism. And I'm not the scholar to tell you, because as scholars go, he's one of the most remarkably nuanced probably there ever was. So, but the extent to which we're seeing the degradation of free flow of capital, nominally low cost access to critical information, credit, right. Free flow of credit and information, right. But even those assumptions now are becoming so arid and so desiccated of meaning and content that what are we really talking about? Here enters an interesting critique, as it were, an author. I'd have to look at my bookshelf. Race over class. So that's the race over class is the argument that mm-hmm. prior to capital making any sense, there had to be the colonial gaze subordinating everyone to its ideology. And capitalism becomes a way of aerating feudalism and that level of domination, that arbitrary domination, onto a world and calling it free and equal access. And now we're laboring under contract with each other and not under the force of gunboat, this or that gunboat diplomacy. We are under contract. So it's a walking around the block of all of that power reconstituting under contract. Interesting, then back to this film, is really the basis of it was contract law and the cheating of it, the gaming of it, and the pretense that there's anything fair at all, under conditions where the power, the might of capital goes up against anything else. The contract is entering into the contract is a pretense, and this film plays that out and usefully. I guess I've spent enough time on that.
No, you're fine.
So for me, the other made black and the long history of Supreme Court decisions, abnegations, legal, constitutional, or rather, Supreme Court rectifications, reversals, but always kind of half-baked, always highly politicized. The story from Civil War to Reconstruction, Jim Crow onward, is a story of duplicitous sort of maneuvers that are, cover stories for a set of regime values that intend to continuously reestablish entitlements that are arbitrary. And for me, as an urbanist, everything is somewhere. Everything happens somewhere. As we enter into the virtual world, and one reason The Matrix is a compelling story is because somewhere becomes virtual, but it's a dream world, and dreams also have coordinates of place, right? And back to our opening discussion, in a world where challenging the tropes and narratives that are so heavy-handed, from this true source of COVID to safe and effective, to how could a breach on 15 different points virtually simultaneously of the most secure border the world has ever known occur without foreknowledge. In that world, what are we standing on when we claim when we make any association between what is and what we just want something to be? So, yeah, I got multiple trains of thought. I think I may have just slipped on the one we were on. You want to, yeah.
I had a quick question about, we talked about liminal boundaries, the last episode we did together, episode 53. And I asked that question, not as a setup question today. I was just reflecting on the interview, but I was thinking, because as a writer myself, there's a process that goes into the writing, but there's also a point in history that you're in when you're writing something. It could be an event or whatever. You have the benefit of living during the same time of that event. And I guess this question will lead to, when did you write The Other Made Black? Was that in 2016 when you wrote that?
Sounds about right, yeah.
And then you wrote the article about imperial terror regarding the war in Ukraine and Russia, which was the 2014 edition.
2014, yeah.
We talked about how I sort of probed into your mindset then, how you were maybe giving Obama the benefit of the doubt. So that kind of showed what your mind was then.
Yeah.
Compared to The Other Made Black, where would you say your mindset was when it came to criticism towards these world governments and these coordinated events and all these connections? How would you compare that 2016 writing process moment to when you wrote From Greta to the Great Reset?
Thanks. It's a great question. I mean, so I was closely involved with inquiry into sort of, as it were, 9/11 truth, the 9/11 truth movement. I was very closely involved. I was a panel member for Consensus 9/11, and I think we've touched on this, right? And so so for my generation, those who are paying attention, 9/11 was their JFK assassination. Sort of, wait a minute, it's a very traumatizing event for which the evidence didn't add up. Didn't quite add up. And I went down that rabbit hole as it seemed to me well, whatever. You know, I mean, I was just starting my career academically, and aware of the extraordinary privileges and entitlements I was given under the mantle of tenure, to ask the indelicate questions, to follow leads where they will go, as one should, you know. But that too often simply doesn't happen. It simply doesn't, for lots of reasons. But 9/11 was my, as it were, JFK doubt, you know, that it was very, wait a minute, what's really going on? You know, what is really going on here? And the whole Matrix thing was timely with that. I had just started my teaching career when the film came out, just started. And so it was in its way formative in many ways. And yet anyone who had read a little bit of Descartes' meditations would realize what we're talking about, and that the film schematizes. How do we know what we think is real is so, and not created by an evil genius to deceive us? And the film begins with that meditation. It fundamentally begins with that meditation. In fact, that meditation, number 6 maybe of Descartes, was in early release of the film, opened the film. So after credits came Descartes' meditation. It was removed. That meditation was removed in later, certainly in the DVD release, it was removed. And it's, you know, it's way too far back to remember it in cinema, but people were still going to cinemas back then to see things. and that's where I saw it. And I don't know if continuously in the release, but why would it be removed? Why can you no longer find it? You get it, if you get the Matrix on Prime, you get it wherever you get it, you will not find that meditation. So whatever. I think that's interesting. The connection then forward from 9/11 and all of what that was and wasn't about to COVID is another warp in my confidence. You know, never would I have imagined what I did with so many others at the forefront of that episode in our history. Never did I see that coming. And people I really respect, they didn't see it coming. And so for audience members who I'm sure you're going to reach sooner than later, Kiko, who otherwise aren't inducted into our level of studied skepticism, you know, what do you mean? What you talking about? What happened? So I'll just, you know, but then came Greta. And I was asked to write a piece about Greta. I was asked by the editor of the journal, American Journal of Economic Sociology. Cliff Cobb asked me to write that piece. He knows me through other channels. And he wanted a sort of sizing up of Greta and the influence of, as it were, greenwashing on, you know, to what extent, you know, the influences that produced her were corporate and capital based, and to what extent they were otherwise. And so I did the dive that I did in that piece, from Greta to the Great Reset, discovering that Greta is an artifact of media savvy through and through. It's not to impugn the character of a delicate 16-year-old, but her lineage back to her great grandfather forward to her mother and father are deep into Swedish, the highest levels of Swedish influence in politics. And there's other connections there too, that make her coming out party as the world's, you know, cover girl for, you know, cover girl for, you know, this scorching critique of all things adult when it comes to the environment, this criminalizing of negligence, you know, this withering sort of scorn and shrill and piercing repetitive incantations were highly rehearsed. Whoever Greta Thunberg really is as a person, the media production of her is extremely, extremely well coordinated. And the connection of her family and the influences on her to carbon capture markets and sort of maneuvers into those markets is well documented. Cory Morningstar did an excellent job of this, and a big part of my background on that piece is a credit to him and his early inquiry into who are we really talking about with Greta Thunberg. So, the agenda, as it were, the carbon capture is such a pretense. It's such a pretense as by any means effective market mechanism for what it claims, assuming that what it claims is even really as critical in the scheme of pollution as that claim is. So, setting that aside for a minute, the claim that carbon capture is the market mechanism that will be harnessed by all things indifferent to capitalism to produce this magical effect of a market demand for reducing carbon is specious through and through, fundamentally because it's driven by capitalist principles that can easily cheat the premise, and the principles easily cheat them. So with all sorts of motives to do so, and then under the rubric that the market will govern and save us, what happens to regulation? What happens to democratic processes of the people's will? What happens to accountability? Where is it? If all of it's reduced to market transactions and regulation is there only to set up the game and authorize the players, you get, again, the tendency toward monopoly. And you'll have those who are able to afford it buying all the carbon from those who can't. So then what you get as one-time buyouts, right, for a perpetual, continuous, ad infinitum entitlement to produce all the carbon that the big players want. They just buy out all of everyone else's carbon rights. Now, there's nominally a cap and trade, but that is a very political process. How that's going to be. Getting back to urban planning, there's a thing called an urban growth boundary, urban service boundary, that's supposed to contain urban sprawl, against which there's constant pressure of the few jurisdictions in the nation that went that way. Portland went that way. What happens is the land values within the urban service boundary start to go up because you've nominally removed from beyond that boundary development rights. What happens is there's constant pressure on that boundary to expand, number one, as with cap and trade, constant pressure. Then there's the inflation of the value on those credits, as with the land value within urban service boundary goes up, and fewer people can afford it. One of the reasons Portland has this homeless problem that's all over the country. It's not remotely exclusive to Portland, but Portland's rents are quite high, proportionate to prevailing wage, higher than all sorts of cities its size elsewhere. Certainly not higher than Seattle, certainly not higher than San Francisco, but high. And one reason for that, absolutely, is urban service boundary that solved a number of issues, and it created a new ecology of games for urban development that helped save Portland, reduce suburban sprawl. It helped reduce suburban sprawl to a certain extent, and it changed the expectations of people for what American cities could do. And we go on and on about Portland that way. But nothing fails like success, because you solve for one set of, right, and then you just keep kicking down the road any number of others. So Greta, carbon capture, the corporate influences that are just one degree of separation from her. The incoherence when she is off script, the way she speaks, her profound lack of command of the issues and information at hand suggests that she's scripted, overwhelmingly she's prompted. She's now a young woman in her mid-20s, and she, I believe, early 20s or mid-20s, and she should be able to handle herself. You'd think that, who she was and who she's associated with, her devotions, as they were so persuasive and convincing, you'd think she'd go on to become second to none as a leader for her generation and able to command pertinent facts. I've not seen, what I've mostly seen is her removed virtually entirely from any kind of venue that would challenge her, engage her to where she would host anything. If it exists, I'd like to see it. And what I have seen is very, very choreographed and managed appearances at, of all places, Davos. So again, the cynicism one can begin associating with that is understandable. And I wanted to write that piece to, begin making these, Now, perhaps the connection you see, but I wait your take with The Other Made Black, is her great-great-great-grandfather and his association with the Eugenics Society in Sweden, and who was a early adopter of eugenics thinking, racialized sort of genetic endowments that are immutable and heritable, and which if the gene exists, we certainly haven't found it. And for which now the prevailing it is now at best quaint and otherwise considered absolutely racist thinking to entertain, from Planned Parenthood and its origins with eugenic affiliations, and to other institutions that have carried that banner and laundered that banner through all sorts of other sort of affiliations and research support. And so they're Johns Hopkins University. They're the host site for Event 201. So there are these, and it's a Herculean task to do the social network analysis that makes these connections, like what Whitney Webb does, right? Extraordinary social network. Fundamentally, her journalism reduces down for me to social network analysis. So who knows who knows someone else. Mm-hmm. It's a very forensic approach to what she does for her journalism, and she's phenomenally gifted at it and devoted to it. So there's a lot of work there. I try to connect some of the dots in my own work, but not in a current events way like Whitney Webb. I do it more in the sort of historic, stable sort of sources. But the connection there with Greta, of course, is in her family is eugenics orientation, which is a pseudoscience devoted to racializations. Singularly, that's what it's devoted to. And then for me, the laundering of all of that into greenwashing. When you start talking about carbon credits, you start talking about market exclusions to the means of capital. That's fundamentally what you're talking about. And when you're talking about those exclusions, you're talking almost certainly about a case structure of access to resources. And when you're talking about that, you're talking about the same old thing. You're talking neocolonialism fundamentally. Now it's been laundered as an emergency. Mm-hmm. Manifestly apparent, so obvious that a 16-year-old who hasn't finished high school can explain it to you. And I guess we need that scorn and derision from a 16-year-old, because as adults, we become so inured to the consequences of our actions. But make no mistake, the subtext of a youth denouncing adults is extraordinary. Her criticism has nothing to do with capital, much less with colonialism. Her critique has to do with a profound moral failure of the grown-ups in the room, for which only the kids seem suitable to call it out. Map that onto the implications. No government is ready, capable, much less even disposed to addressing these issues. So what or who is? Some autocrat with absolute power, benevolent, of course, it seems to be seamlessly implied by the Greta narrative. There is no other place to go. And you'll get grown-ups in the room agreeing with her. You'll get very schooled and reasoned and studious adults all across academia agreeing with the 16-year-old. No government is sufficient. No government, much less democracy, is sufficient for this challenge. And I pressed someone speaking at our university recently, otherwise very capable, I'll leave the name out, very studied in matters having to do with the process thought of Alfred North Whitehead. And it was an outstanding presentation. And my question was, are you not concerned? She mapped it into all things green, implications for the environment, crises here, crisis there, crisis, and so on. And she mapped it there carefully. My challenge was, do you have any concerns for the autocratic implications of a world for which no current institution seems tooled to deal with this crisis? For instance, China, with its ESG scoring that is not at the corporate, merely at the corporate level, but at the individual level. The threat there to individual freedoms is straight up. Now, and you know, where you can have your credit cut off because you ate too much, you produced too much carbon last week. What is the concern? And her response was, the question was unexpected. She was not ready for the question. She had not thought about the question. She had not given it any thought. Because it wasn't on the clock for her thinking. It wasn't that it didn't rise to the level of a significant threat to everything. You know, and she concluded that while she'd hoped that we would work out these matters in nominally social democratic channels, that at some point there had better be compliance. It was very clear that there had better be a decisive response to climate catastrophe. There had better be. This was her closing comment. And it was clear that the concerns I raised were subordinate and barely and only relevant in kind of a, well, yes, there's China, and yes, there are these propensities, and yes, it's worrisome, but here's hoping.
There was a lot that you talked about there, and you had already mentioned the eugenics part. That I'm actually going to an observation that I found in the article from Greta to the Great Reset, and I'm going to, I guess, try to add something to that because first, the comparison between from the Greta to the Great Reset and the Other Made Black is interesting because you talk about the exclusion that Thunberg uses, this technique that honestly I attribute to, I mean, we know that she's one of the puppets, you know, within the, you know, carrying out the agendas of the World Economic Forum or whoever else it is, Klaus Schwab, or, you know, the person who created this whole thing in the first place in 71. But I think in Greta's case, you have the 16-year-old, and then you had the sort of like the embedded fact, you know, the autism intersectionality with the youth. And so there's this embedded excuse almost to where there is exclusions within this whole environmental debate and discussion. Like you said, there's a lot that she doesn't talk about at all, conveniently. Who does this affect, these climate catastrophes? Never talks about the victims, never gives names to the victims, only sticks to the agenda. And you make the comparison with white labor movement, but then you had this Black population that had been disenfranchised before the white unions could really grow, before these laws could even come into existence, these labor acts and everything else. And we're talking around the Great Depression period. Interestingly enough, when you talked about the eugenics piece, I would only expand that the eugenics theory, you say here, eugenics theory and practice were common in Scandinavian countries prior to World War II, with Sweden taking the leading position. I would argue that at that point, it was just a worldwide phenomenon because everything laid the blueprint for eugenics to thrive during that period. We're talking about in between the world wars. You're talking about Nazi Germany. You're talking about 1927, the Burke versus Bell Supreme Court decision. Kerry Buck legalized sterilization by the government, basically legitimized it, saying that these undesirable people, because of the times we're in, and this is not immune to Latin America either. A lot of people bring this stuff up, and I have to sit people down basically, like in my circles, that like to play this this rainbow coalition, this the Brazil has this big time, the racial democracy myth, which is bullshit. We know that there's no racial democracy at all. And interestingly enough, from Brazil, Gilberto Freire, 1933, anthropologist. During this period of time between the world wars, you had anthropologists really interested in Black people, non-white people. Gilberto Freire, Casa Grande Senzala, 1933, The Master and the Slaves. You had Monteiro Lobato, or Presidente Negro, the Black president, 1926, Brazil as well. And the interesting thing about the Black president that was written in 1926, it's a sci-fi novel. I've read it before. It's a dark, dark, dark messaging. But you have to understand, you're talking about 1926, during the time of eugenics is probably at its height around the world. And you have this white Brazilian guy writing about an election in 2226, a presidential election where the 88th president is a Black man in the United States. Barack Obama happens to be the 44th president of the United States, half of the 88, which is crazy. But this is a sci-fi novel written in 1926. And this actually got popular when Obama got into office, but it basically condones the genocide because at the end, Jim, who's the Black candidate, wins the last hour because you had, I forgot the white woman's name, who she was going against the white guy. But regardless, you have three characters. The Black guy wins at the end. Jim Roy wins by some kind of a 30-minute flash poll. And they end up like poisoning him at the end. Like he got poisoned some kind of way. And so the white guy ended up being president anyway. But if you read it, there's a lot of dark sort of thoughts about basically like these were the ideas at the time. Like, Black people just aren't sharp people. You had the cosmic rays, 1925 in Mexico, Jose Vasconcelos, the cosmic rays. This whole idea of Latin people being just this super race of people. We have Black people, Asian people, white people. We make up everyone in the world, Middle Easterners, and it just goes on and on. So that's what I kind of took from that. When you talked about Sweden, I was like, it really got me to think about Latin America, my own area of expertise, because I talk about this a lot in my dissertation, how during this period is pretty much a period that's not talked about a lot because we like to shy away from Nazi Germany. Oh my gosh, that could never happen again. That stuff could never happen. But it did happen. And those ideas just don't die in the sun. They don't die in the shadows either. And so I took a lot from those two articles, but it's just so weird how you can really connect anything you want to. That's really, I got that too. You can connect any of these events the way you see fit, and they kind of fit together in this puzzle, this broad geopolitical puzzle.
And the ideas don't come from nowhere. The Germans had come to I don't know exactly the date, but they had studied the American South at some point. I don't know if it was antebellum or in Reconstruction. I think it was Reconstruction because they wanted to know how a tiny white minority had managed to control such a vast majority. What were the mechanisms? And it was the notion the National Socialist notion of the one-drop rule that was the basis for the Nuremberg Code, the Germans got from the South. They used the one drop because they couldn't, right? That worked for their, not the octagon or the sword. That didn't work. The one drop is what they adopted, the most absolute and elusive and utterly unprovable, right? So all you needed was the most specious connection. And since canon law for Judaism follows the mother's line, it's self-evident that you're Jewish. If your mother's Jewish, her mother's Jewish, right? Her father, that the line goes back to the mother's line, and so it's the cheapest cheat you could make on the one drop with the one drop rule. Okay, so to your right. Ideas that were laying around and that were that have been rehashed or reproduced in so many ways, more or less elusively. Absolutely. I have to read your dissertation. Got to get with what you wrote.
Oh, guys, good luck, man. It's funny. I might as well plug this in since people probably already know what I mentioned in a couple episodes, because I did 2 special episodes 2 weeks ago. I reviewed the first 2 chapters of my dissertation. I have to review the third and the fourth. But basically, I'm going to produce a book within the next 3 years. That's the goal. I'm in the process of working with the book. I'm working possibly with the publisher too. I have a few connections. So that's my goal, is to get this out within the next 2.5, 3 years. And yes, if you read my dissertation, that'd be great. I think it'd be interesting to a lot of people. I need to delete a lot of stuff in there because, when you see it in the flesh, it's like, oh gosh, I wrote that. And then so you see a few grammatical errors, it's like, oh gosh, let me get rid of that. But
every dissertation's got them.
No doubt. But I had an overall, I guess, question that I asked Jay Carrico yesterday, and I know you may have a different take on this, but I'm just curious. We haven't really talked about Gaza and Israel, and I honestly don't want to go into the weeds with that. I mean, because I think that's a proper discussion, maybe just like pinpointed for hours. We're really just all over the place talking about different things, these different connections. But I can only think about 2020 again. I mean, let's just, for these people, you said tinfoil. I don't even know how much this stuff is tinfoil at this point. I think it's good to have a healthy dose of conspiratorial thoughts and whatever it is. But let's just take the basic 2020, the shit show that was with the virus, the lockdowns, George Floyd protests, Breonna Taylor, black people mattering or not mattering, blue lives mattering, all this shit. Is this newest installment to you, which is a conflict that's happened? We can use 1948 as a basis between the Israeli and the Arab issue, this dichotomy that's been created, really just exploded in the media. Is this the new BLM moment, a COVID moment of 2020, 2019? Or are we experiencing this just again? And we're in another election year. Who knows what's going to happen in the summer in 2024? But I was thinking that the whole time when this happened. You've already alluded to the issue of this hyper secure area, and this just happened to be the situation. Like, they allowed this to happen. Netanyahu's popularity is waning at best. Right wing in Israel, people in his own country are protesting. So what do you make of this? Is this a repeat of 2020 using a different event that's already had a basis?
An interesting premise. Yeah, I think it certainly has the appearance, anything like this with murky provenance in an election year has the appearance of a tail wag dog, as with Clinton and Bosnia. It's an off-the-shelf incident made to order for a massive distraction, well-timed, that, for which the evidence, the history of success is quite high. The success rate is quite high. So why not do it again? One can, to your point, it is intellectually dishonest all the way down to refuse to entertain the notion that the narrative is constructed, and that one ought to follow the money. It's also so inconsistent with reasonable adult level cognitive capacity and not so adult level cognitive capacity to differentiate bullshit from otherwise. It's a level of discernment that is innate and instinctual to suspicion, skepticism, if not suspicion. So why the out of bounds when the events that are most important in our world and our lives are so porous and so so leaky in their fundamental narrative structure? Why there are we excluded? In the case of the current round with Israel, it certainly would fit. Any number of beneficiaries are evident from this. One could say, but that's a facile criticism. You could always ex post facto find beneficiaries of any number of instances. Okay, fair enough. But then you start stacking on the variables in the equation. You say, well, but it's an election year, unpopular prime minister, on and on. You stack on, and then you start to, the more you produce and interrogate variables that are relevant, the more systematic is your criticism, the more studied is your theory. Conspiracy theory is a trope. It's a put down. It's a dismissal that has currency to the extent that people don't do it well. This is back to Brett Weinstein saying it's not, the problem isn't that there's theorizing. The problem is that it's not done well. Mm-hmm. It's done in knee-jerk ways that are lazy thinking, that don't systematically examine. There's the problem here. The challenge is, first of all, getting the information in real time. You can always get real information after the fact at some point. It's not fresh information, and its relevance is discounted by time. But getting real-time information is very costly and very difficult, extremely difficult. You have to have squadrons of people doing this to really get to the bottom. And so you inevitably have inference. You inevitably have leaps of logic. You inevitably have speculation. And the extent to which speculation is policed is spectacular. Look at COVID. Look at Stanford-trained Jay Bhattacharya. Stanford trained or Stanford teaching? I think it's Stanford teaching. Position is Stanford. Jay Bhattacharya. And so many others, right, who are very capable epidemiologically, virologically, immunologically, questioning the narrative. And they were run out. They were run out of positions in a witch hunt that has remarkable congruence with the Cold War era and the influence of HUAC with Joseph McCarthy. Just a few weeks ago, finished reading the Oppenheimer biography, co-authored by a couple of what's their names, American Prometheus, story of J. Robert Oppenheimer. And the real story there that's being told is the hysteria of the Cold War. On the one hand, there's the making of the building of the bomb, but that's a very small part of the story. A huge part of the predominant part of the story is the witch hunting of him and his affiliations and how that would haunt him in his career and really destroy him. This guy who was Man of the Year time, he was the darling of I mean, who to associate with him with in our time? I don't know that there's any public figure you could associate Oppenheimer. The heroism associated with Oppenheimer, the scientist as hero trope, that, I mean, I don't know who would rise to the level around us at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But the real story was how he was harassed and destroyed by the interrogation machine that was the Cold War apparatus of FBI, led in big way by the FBI. And it's startling now, the vicious motivations that have no center to them, except you cannot say what we don't want you to say. And we spoke earlier about the Matrix, and the penultimate scene in the last of this part 3, Matrix Revolutions, was it, where he makes it to the machine city, and to the right, and to the godhead of the machine city, which was, numberless tiny drones that wove their way into the shape of an infant's head. And, the inflected with this, sort of demonic voice, but an infant. Mm-hmm. And I recall telling you, it was startling juxtaposition for me. Nominally the most innocent being, by definition, an infant, associated with the most diabolical. And anyone who's been any length of time around an infant knows how demanding that by definition, an infant is. But to extrapolate from that, the horror of absolute sort of demands that tolerate no deviation. So giving an infant's head, and particularly the demonic way in which it takes shape with these drones, and it's just a little child, it's just horrible. It's just never seen that before. But that is startling. One reason I use film, you're cautious in the movies you see, and have a very strict minimalist diet there. I use film a lot, Kiko, and for teaching and even writing purposes. Maybe I'll send you another piece I did that was published as a book chapter, and I can't remember the title now, but I worked with, tried to describe very much the features of The Other Made Black. So I used a lot of that front end material in this other piece where I said, where you have such elusive where you have such elusive liminal boundaries designating value and truth and fact, woven seamlessly into popular cultures, you have to turn to fiction to tease out important distinctions. The writers and the storytellers and the songwriters often are way ahead, and the rules for their creation are relatively loose, certainly compared with academic, sort of strictures, the straitjacket of academia, as you're familiar with. And so you can go there because they can limb and boundaries and break rules all over the place. So I worked with Huckleberry Finn, mm-hmm. Invisible Man, and The Matrix. And I used the 3 to explain The Other Made Black. I used those 3 narrative story structures and connected them together. Ralph Ellison, Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain, to Ralph Ellison, who wrote a wonderful essay about comparing Twain to Hemingway. It was the 20th Century and the Black Mask of Humanity, I think is the title of the essay. And he made that connection for me back to Twain, and in particular Huck Finn. So I use Huck Finn. What's my point? These literary connections can be so useful in teasing out how come, wherefore do we find ourselves, right? They can use irony and juxtaposition to right, in the way that sort of Theodor Adorno at the Frankfurt School posited doing likewise in his praxis for discernment and inquiry. So, yeah, I'm lost.
No, I got a question. No, I got a question for you. I'm so glad you started talking about. So you don't even have to tell me your favorite movie of all time, because I'm the type person, I've watched more movies than I've realized, but I'm curious, what is one of your favorite movies of all time?
Wow, that's a tough one. Any movie that tries hard to tell a story faithfully and refuses the cheap formulations of character and caricature, and you know, I will watch. I mean, my diet is quite broad, omnivorous for film. So, gosh, I mean, there are some of the masters of film, the Italian masters, French masters, Akira Kurosawa, Japanese, you know, and of late, this I consider Fox a master of sorts. I really do. A relatively young master, not that young at this point. Extraordinary talent, and I have not seen a film produced by him before. If he's done it, I haven't seen it, but I would see anything he does. Yeah. So, but favorite, you know, and I don't, when I teach or use, it's not that these are stories that I want to read and over again. I will say that one of my favorite books, absolutely of all time, is Invisible Man. Novels. I think it's so singular, and it's a mastery of what Ellison was trying to do. It was his first novel, and it was essentially his last complete novel. I think it was just one and done, and he was under such extraordinary pressure to produce another one. First novel, National Book Award winner, you know, first out. It was such a whole cloth vision. It was spectacular. So, I love Mark Twain. I don't know where to go. You asked me about film,
but see that's, you're proving my point. That's why I don't mess with film much. I have a knowledge of film through books because I'm a book critic. So I always ask people, name me your favorite movie and tell me if the book wasn't produced before the film was. That's why I mess with books. Films are okay, but you don't have the film without the book. And so that's kind of how I am. And that's not to say that the film doesn't have value, but usually the film is based off of the literary book. Like, it's already based off the pre-existing literature. Like, maybe it's different now, but I know a lot of the classics are usually based on something like a novel or something else.
I couldn't tell you to what extent the proportion of great film is based on a pre-existing, but certainly the great filmmakers are very literate.
Yes.
That's certainly the case. And they're using, they press film into purposes that only film can meet, to address matter that a whole lot of literature does otherwise, that only it can meet in literary ways. But film is a late comer. Film is a late comer, right, in the history of storytelling. So what it offers is late coming. It's idiom. We're still trying to figure out what to do with it. But to what extent the great films are based on book, I couldn't tell you, and I defer. I think an awful lot of film stories are very close to literature. The great, certainly very, as I said, the writers are very literate. And then it's an ensemble production. It's directors and writers working together. In ways that literature is such an individualistic, right? Filmmaking is such an ensemble production. So in so many ways unique for storytelling, very unique. And a good friend of mine who's an English guy, ABD English, super precocious, bright guy, never finished. Many great minds never finish that process. I remember when we were talking about this, or that series from Mad Men to whatever, and how the series now is seriously threatening written literature, because it can tell stories in this elongated long form that had been the province of literature, right? Where you could go, well, is it better than the book? It's, films based on books are always exclusions. They always leave out. And we just watched the other night, The Firm. So that was Grisham's, one of Grisham's early books, right? Grisham, was it John Grisham? I don't remember Grisham's first name, but he was an attorney, right? And he wrote these books that were very popular, and many of which were made into film. The Firm with Tom Cruise and a absolute all-star cast, right? Gene Hackman plays is in that. Others that are all-star. The film was in some ways better than the book. Who cares? I don't know how this, but the ending was way more inventive. The ending of the book, The Firm, was kind of cliche. Everyone ends up somewhere else. They go to the island with the money and they're all safe and sound. They're away. In the film, he doesn't exit. He doesn't want to give up what his hard-won credentials got him. So he retains his authority. He's not going to be defrocked as an attorney and go into the witness protection program in this great exchange with Ed Harris. And I'm supposed to trust you guys with how and it's silly how he's always one step ahead of him. And it's that kind of 90s sort of macho, heroic, implausible that no one did worse than Tom Cruise with the Mission Impossible stunt stuff. But this was earlier Tom Cruise, and the ending was much more provocative in that he retained his capacity as attorney, and it was very in step with humanizing the dilemma that he faced. What's my point here? I don't know. In this case, I think the film did better. At best, films have fidelity to the book. I saw Oppenheimer, and it leaves out, like all films, leaves out. It's a huge book, and that's a biography, not literature per se, but it leaves out most of it. But it's also remarkably true to the basic line of the book. It's remarkably true to it, and then there's invention, of course, and stuff you got to leave out. It's an interesting process, I think, how film has to dramatize, maybe, and interestingly, even particularly when it's working with real events, because the real events on film just don't translate. The time scales don't work. There is no dramatization in real life. Everything is mundane and banal. How do you grab people's attention and compress a story in a time frame that's reasonable? You've got to dramatize it. So there's invention, but maybe all the way back to the start of our chat today is, where is the line? Where is that line between truth and otherwise? I've overdone my references to the Matrix, but it, in its way, with a lot of invention, limbs that line originally and ahead of its time, 20 plus years ago now. And it foreshadowed a police state that would prevail, not in very close order with the film. The first film came out in 1999, the fall of 1999. By the fall of 2001, it was a not so brave new world order in profound ways, right? Then it had its sequences came after, which is kind of startling, really. The post 9/11 world, the same trilogy, and it was remarkable for how the correspondence between, from the Patriot Act to. And this was a piece I wrote on the Conjuring the Holographic State using the Matrix. It was an relatively early piece I wrote, published in 2008 with my friend, recently deceased, Lance Hayden Smith. But the correspondence with the Patriot Act, the narrative substructure of the Patriot Act, hews remarkably closely to the story told in the Matrix. And the way we presented it was, where do you go? Where do you go to make sense? right? As thinking people, where do you go to make sense when none of the rules make sense? Now what do you do? The world has been inverted. What happens when you don't just lack confidence, but your confidence is inverted? You expect things to be other than they're described or normalized to be. You expect them now to be other. So your skepticism now becomes profound skepticism. And it's not a happy place to be any length of time. And you and I and those of our tribe have to practice a kind of emotional hygiene to keep from despair. I mean, they call it resilience, and they associate it with people, the same old people that for which victimization is the only option given. And this again played in the trial somewhat. Who's the victim? Who's the perp? And from Black Lives Matter to the fetishization of victim recapitulates racializations. There is no there to race. That's not to say people aren't victimized by the no there that they are victimized by. But to refuse the interrogation of the nothing at the center is to recapitulate something where there's nothing. Mm-hmm. And so victimization becomes the currency, the common currency, it always deflating. It's a currency, it's a capital, it's a cultural capital that's always deflating in a way, because you're as a perpetual victim, given few other options other than a signifier for failures of democracy or that which still needs but never can be really settled. Somehow the doubt around that is self-fulfilling, and all claims to victimization then become cheated or cheapened by the refusal to interrogate the assumptions that produced the victimization in the first place. And so there becomes what I call carpetbagging for equity. It's sort of to reverse the trope, right? The carpetbaggers who came, in a sense, back to the Civil War, right? The perception of the Northerners coming down and exploiting the catastrophic conditions of the South and buying up as much as they could of property, right? Carpetbagging. And what I'm seeing is carpetbagging on carpetbagging now for so-called equity and so-called diversity and inclusion. It's not that those are bad things. It's not at the point, but they are tropes that are so drained of a critical interrogation of the basis of the claims, the basis of the importance. They're so drained of critical interrogation, other than sort of cheapened post-colonial thought, cheapened this. There is awful lot to work with under the rubric of intersubjectivity. This is not a dismissal, but as this gets packaged in ways that are increasingly formulaic and dogmatic. I was at a training recently where I had to announce my pronouns.
Oh God, are you serious?
There was no way, and flitting through my mind was a moment of truth, right? Do I say, well, me, myself, and mine, me, myself, and I, or sometimes I, me, mine, or I, me twice, and then mine. If I did that, Kiko, I would have gotten a call from Human Resources. I would have been called into Human Resources. Someone would have complained. Someone would have complained anonymously.
I already know
that that was a microaggressive behavior, that it was premeditated, intended to challenge the integrity of this or that and reproduce victimization because I could. So I had to succumb to my pronoun affiliation. He and him, I guess.
He, him, yeah. I got to get this one question before we go because I got to cut it at about 15 to 20 more minutes, but I have to get this overarching question
Yeah.
because it's such a big part of your Great Reset article, COVID-19, obviously. Um, I want you to just briefly tell people what Clade X was, what Event 201 was, and I also want to think about this whole idea around COVID. Me personally, like people know that I'm a skeptical person. I get that from my dad. Hopefully, my dad will come on the show. He will. He said he is. He was supposed to be episode 50, which that was 20 episodes ago. So obviously, he hasn't been on yet, but he will be on. But regardless, we free thinking types. I just wonder about the COVID narrative. And I'm not really outing Robert Malone, but Robert Malone became one of the figureheads of the COVID-19 saga. Anthony Fauci became a figurehead within this whole Judy Mikovits. All these different doctors, who were speaking against the official narrative, were speaking against Fauci from the beginning. They were talking about how he fucked up the AIDS pandemic back in the late 70s to 80s. But the whole idea around it, it seems like now the same people who that was their issue was COVID, they seem to be positioning themselves into another, I won't call it an echo chamber, but they're in another moment. And maybe that sustains them for 3 or 4 more years until the next big thing happens. And then I guess that's the biggest thing about COVID for me. It's like I heard about the opposition to the official narrative so much because of who I followed and stuff. But at some point, when does it become like an oversaturation of that same group of people saying, okay, the government's saying this, we're like, no, this something's fucked up, something's not working out, something's not adding up. We're 4 years and we're still talking about that now. So I guess I have to question, like, what is the end game into that thought process with something that becomes kind of, I won't say consensus generally, but within certain circles, it was like, yeah, okay, we get it. Like, we agree with you about the whole COVID narrative, the skepticism towards the government, the whole precondition of the Patriot Act, of all these surveillance acts to begin with, to set the tone for this. This is a worldwide thing. But where do we go now, I guess is the question, Matt. Do we still talk about COVID? When do we talk about something else? Can we walk and chew gum at the same time? I guess, do you kind of see where I'm getting at with that? But also the Clade X and also the Event 201 within that.
Well, I got to go back to my piece to get some of the detail there.
Oh yeah,
useful. And I just touch on it, and I got this from this Rechtenwald reference that I make. But let me give you. So Clade X was like Event 201. It was an exercise that staged the outbreak of a novel strain of para-influenza virus. The simulation concluded with a dramatic staging of a news report announcing that without effective vaccines, experts tell us that we could eventually see 30 to 40 million deaths in the US and more than 900 million around the world, et cetera, et cetera. And then that was Clade X, which was in 2018, I believe. And then in 2019, that was a World Economic Forum hosted event. Again, World Economic Forum in 2019 hosted event 201. And this occurred just 2 months before the announcement of the COVID outbreak from Wuhan, right? It simulated an international response to the outbreak of just such a virus. Anthony Fauci had said the quiet part out loud 1 year previously when he said at Georgetown University, there is no quote, there is no question that there will be a challenge to the coming administration in the arena of infectious diseases. There will be no, Anthony Fauci, there will be no question that this is going to happen. And Rechtenwald sums it up pretty usefully when he says Clade X and Event 201 simulations anticipated almost every eventuality of the actual COVID crisis. most notably the responses by governments, health agencies, the media, tech companies, and elements of the public. Almost as if it had been simulated out, as if it had been dry rehearsal, as if, right? The responses and their effects include a worldwide lockdowns, the collapse of business and industries, the adoption of biometric surveillance tech, and an emphasis on social media censorship to combat misinformation, the flooding of social and legacy media with authoritative sources, widespread riots and mass unemployment enter your BLM component. And you also have, for me, here, the old tactic of policy of tension. Get subunits of your society pitted against one another. So BLM was issued permits by all sorts of local authorities across the country, but no one else was during the time of COVID. And then there's all sorts of roundabout rationales for, well, but of course, you know, and so this sort of incantation, this shrill circular incantation. And then so what you then produce is another sub-narrative, which is the hard wing, the radical right wing is angry. And then you have, like clockwork, you know, Floyd, right? And you have like clockwork any number of incidents, except behind the curtain. And there were multiple reports at Black Lives Matter protests from one city to the next. There was this weird staging and noticing of police around with pallets of bricks and other weapons, other material that could be weaponized. And all of a sudden a riot happens, and it's blamed on Antifa or whomever, or some elusive right sort of radicals, right? And you had early on, and I lost this source, but some guy did remarkable provenance work on a pay stub issued to Antifa protesters that he tied back to Soros, a pay stub for showing up and doing the dirty work of starting a riot. So, you know, these agent provocateur, which is a tactic as old as the hill, installed at events that are already made ironically delegitimized, when the issue is one of timeless legitimacy. Black lives not mattering on a par that, ought to be. And then you have the incidents that further marginalize, that play right into the narrative that the radical right wing supposedly is keyed up about. You get this lathering up of divisions that are epiphenomenal to the fundamental criticism. Am I hanging out with conservative voices on pundits and Substacks and spokesmen and, you know, from Jordan Peterson to Ben Shapiro? I'm paying very close attention to these guys now, and how they formulate their critiques, and I've had to, and I should have done it sooner. But the stirring up, the stirring up of largely fictionalized antagonisms that have a basis in history, Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazis, that continue through the present, but that are so timely and like clockwork associated with murky provenance, mass shootings under Obama, spectacular frequency, with ridiculous claims of fact and immediate contradictions and on the ground evidence and people sit right in the chatter. And it was obvious that many of these incidents were so murky, so suspicious, right? But the timing, your point is to ask the question of the timing. A good friend of mine, amateur filmmaker, described COVID early on to me as 9/11 in slow motion. To your question, right? To your question, what's the next? Are we now being subjected to a low simmer of continuous incidents, right? And what about 5G?
No.
What about what we don't know about 5G to stimulate anxiety and trigger all sorts of cognitive disarray? Because the orders of magnitude of that electromagnetism are way beyond anything we've been subjected to before. And so again, scandal, oh, that's a conspiracy, that's a conspiracy. So many conspiracy theories, so-called, have been, as Jimmy Dore will announce, sort of, it's a foregone that they're going to be true. Just whenever you hear it, just understand that it's almost certainly more often than not true. It may be a clunky, it may be clunky in how it's articulated, but to answer your provocative question, the time we have left, I don't know what sort of wave pattern we're on, what sort of amplitude of emergency, what the frequency of the wave is, and what its amplitude. I don't know. It does feel to me, Kiko, with COVID, that we're in something new. We're in a new stage of super late capitalism, for which crises is the only solution. Because really what capitalism does is it destroys. And so in the face of massive destructions, to say nothing of fiat currency and its value under these pressures, the only thing that works is crisis, to reorganize a sense of popular acceptance for the steady degradation of cherished truisms. Democracy, one vote, one this. Sure, we never quite got there and maybe never will, but we're always getting better. Obama election timed perfectly after all things Bush and 9/11. Just move on, moveon.org. Never mind, don't pay any attention right? Pay no attention in 2008 to the guy behind the curtain, behind the banking scandal and collapse of 2008. Move on. Off the shelf, ready to go. And from the guy who said we are going to prosecute the banksters. He made a point of that on the campaign trail multiple times, right? Obama is a liar of singular fortitude and capacities, extraordinarily gifted deceiver, first among equals of recent. Yeah, he's got to be first among equals. There's no one is better. You look how clunky Trudeau is. Look how clunky that guy is. Look how clunky Newsom is. Look how clunky.
All of them.
What's that?
Buttigieg,
all of them. They're so clunky. They're so played to script. They're so company actors. They just it's so clean. What happened to the Bill Clintons and the Barack Obamas, man? Those guys, they were Anyway.
Oh, but what I was thinking about too is something, and maybe I don't bring it up honestly because I think it's a bullshit manufactured event too. The Jan 6, like people kind of know where. I think the deepest I ever went into Jan 6 was when I had Jay Clark on episode 21, and we were basically talking from like an everyday Black person perspective, like how we honestly didn't give a fuck about Jan 6 because it seemed like a bunch of bullshit anyway, because the whole narrative was in Black Twitter and Black America. If you talk to people like outside, there's always like with most Black people that I know, there's just this, it's almost an apathy in a way when it comes to like politics. They expect a bunch of drama and a bunch of like theatrics anyway. And so for us, Jan 6 is just an extension of that whole idea of just like, okay, that political shit, whatever, how's it going to affect us? Because they're going to do what they want to do anyway. And the working class is going to be screwed. But the Jan 6 thing, to me, you could easily lay this in the series of events we've already talked about before. And you start to concoct this whole series of the what ifs and who was really in the crowd and all this shit, what measures were put into place before that event happened in the first place. And it's crazy. The most super damn diehard, super liberal people ever, I don't hear nobody talking about Jan 6 right now because there's something else to talk about. But at the time, it was like, oh gosh, this is the worst fucking thing ever. And then it's like, but it's so crazy how all of a sudden that's muted almost now. It seems like it just comes up, goes away, comes up, goes away. And I just think it's amazing how the deep state operates, because you can't tell me that these people don't know the pulse of the people based on when these events are happening. They're like, okay, put that shit on, turn this shit off, put this on, because they know how people are going to react to it.
That's right. And it gets back to the early part of a discussion about conditioning. And at the risk of oversimplification, right, we're in a Skinner box, which gets back to the Matrix, which is also a parable on behavioralism and the Skinner box. And we are, to your point, then your question is now what's going to be the next, and my comeback is, on what frequency and what amplitude. And, there's no telling, but that there's an awful lot of stuff that's off the shelf, and then it passes and it's in the rearview mirror, and we can't ever get a read on it because we're always going around a bend. Mm-hmm. You don't look in your rearview mirror when you're driving forward around curves, and that's kind of what we're being subjected to, right? In a car where the brakes are unsafe, and it's unsafe at any speed, and it's dreamlike in a lot of what it's dreamlike. And to what extent Hollywood has played a role in triggering us, from Outbreak the film, with what was that, with Dustin Hoffman.
Oh yeah, the Ebola virus, all this.
Ebola virus. So there's so many. There's Mark Crispin Miller is a guy you might reach out to who could really give you something on this stuff. He's a media scholar. The extent to which Hollywood has been pressed into service for CIA stuff is nothing to sneeze at. So we're talking full spectrum. Your leading point is, it seems, is full spectrum surveillance but pre-thought crime, right? It's pre-thought crime, which gets us all the way back to Orwell again. Thought crime, and the self-censoring to keep us in line. It's a tactic as old as the hills under any conditions of control, particularly under conditions of metropolitan life, which go, as archaeology is revealing to us, goes way farther back than it continues to reveal to us way farther back than we think. And under metropolitan life, under the close precincts of observation and conformity to norms and signaling of virtue, the high frequency and demands of that on people in metropolitan living conditions are essential to surveillance and control. And again, you get this sort of, you look across geographically, the United States is overwhelmingly red. Numerically by population, we're like this, but geographically, the voting, by county, if you look at a map, it's overwhelmingly red, right? Mm-hmm. Geographically, overwhelmingly red. It's the metropolitan areas that are blue. And why is that? Why do metropolitan vote overwhelmingly hew to the liberal narrative? I wouldn't have asked questions like this 4 years ago like I do now. I'm always catching up with what just happened, Kiko. I'm glad I got you to keep me on point.
No, don't say that. I'm not that. I don't see myself that way. I mean, we're a source of information, but no, I think that the skepticism with you has always been there. It's just like with myself and anyone else, it just comes out at certain points of your life. And the goal of this forum is to also get the people who may not believe that the skepticism is even within, for it to finally come up and rise up to the top, because it's there. It's just a matter of it's nonconformity is everything else, involved with that. But I just wanted to ask if there are any final words or a final message that you have for my audience. And I'm sure Professor Witt will be on down the road. This has been an unbelievable episode 71, and we can't wait for you to come back onto the show. But do you have any final words for my audience?
Always my pleasure. And the point of that you keep me on point is that what you offer here with your platform, that with now so many episodes and growing with outstanding voices and thought, is a not insignificant motivator for me to be paying attention in ways that I otherwise would. So that's for what it's worth. And thank you. The passing thought is, for me, in my revelations to the fractures and fissures in the prevailing narrative is a long journey, but in significant ways, it begins with racializations. In my own family, as I told off tangent, as you're gracious to let me go, my mother's story, and I think I share this, right? My mother's story as half Jewish in Nazi Germany. And so I was raised with a sort of preternatural instinct for what it means to be othered. I'm all white all the time by any one-eyed glance at me. On the other hand, I'm deeply intersubjective. Who would have thunk it? The way I talk, the way I sound, right? And so that has been major in the formation for me. The second major for me was was my career leading me to Southern California, where I was in the numeric minority racially, right? And then to quite frankly, to establish my credibility in the classroom, I had better get with understandings that I had not been sufficiently curious enough about to that point. Yeah. And so I got very busy, right? And so my scholarship headed in that direction to put it all together for me of where do I find myself? What's going on? What's my credibility? Why should anyone listen to me in this classroom anyway? And have all sorts of reasons to be suspicious of me. At the same time, that's a real existential threat to my career. Now, what am I going to do? And then I get in the crosshairs because I decide I need to talk about race and and school myself up. I get in the crosshairs with my liberal colleagues. Why are you paying attention to that? You're supposed to be paying more attention to Foucault and Lacan and intersubjectivity, so-called, and not to these historic institutional practices that hew so much in this singular dimension. Matt, it's a dead end. And I was told I should drop it. Mm-hmm. He said, you got some talent, and so I got even more dug in. And by way of saying, so all things COVID, Greta, this and that, for me, a country like the United States, democracy second to none, if it can get away with the big lie of race, the big lie, one of the biggest lies there ever was, what can't it get away with? And what won't it do to legitimate the pretense of a democracy, which essentially covers a cover story for the most vicious world colonialism that ever has been? It needs a cover story, and it needs divisions. So what's really going on? This potent trope, what's its source? What's its ideology? What's its trajectory? Where does it go? And you're making that connection today from Greta to the other made black. All sorts of other things that you could tell me about, that so many people could tell me about. But for what it's worth, you gracious interlocutor, for me, it does really get back to that big lie. And what does it mean to get away with that? How seductive is it? How formative is it? How much are so many identities based under that spell by what they are not? As an urbanist, cities have been, since the 50s, and urban renewal have mostly been defined by what they are not, and suburbs even more so by what they are not. The suburbs became popularized by what they weren't, not by what they offered. What they offered was long commutes and boring geography and getting in your car to go everywhere. That's what they offered. Fresh air, okay, but you know what? Under the influence of leaded gasoline, it wasn't that fresh. So, what were we really talking about? Well, they were sold by what they weren't. They weren't the central city, which was a signifier for, more and more a disenfranchised, disinvested geography where people who can't get out are stuck. And that became a cover story to the underclass, cover story for the other made black, right? So in a huge way, the way in which this vicious trope has signified has etched itself deeply in the landscape, literally in the landscape of suburbs that are whitened and segregated by all sorts of devious means in spite of legislation to the contrary, continuously still. So what if, if that can happen, and gets back to very personal, because it almost meant I didn't exist. If my mother's family had been killed, I wouldn't exist. And they survived on a ruse, on a trick, barely, down to the wire. So it gets very deep and personal for me when Kiko, when I let it sink in. Am I comparing my circumstances to what it would mean to be Black, to what it would mean to be female and this and that? I am not. But there is an intersubjective transected component there. Absolutely. And the challenge, it seems to me, that is forfeited too often by intellectuals is to interrogate that, to map that wherever it will go. And so where The Matrix is maybe not my favorite film, but an important one, is that it played with the idea of what is the Matrix? That question posed by Trinity to, and Morpheus to Neo, that itch, and Morpheus, but that itch in them that you can't scratch. And Trinity, when she first encountered him, and in a very well-directed, provocative sequence, suggesting to him what he was thinking and what he was about and so on, the point at which she takes him in the car and she said he wants to get out, and he says, "You've been down that road already," right? This sort of the hero's journey, the discovery, again, an ancient trope, but one that's forfeited too often, and going with it where it will take you. In the case of Matrix, from a land of a space overwhelmingly defined by whiteness. Look at how it is scripted. The Matrix land is overwhelmingly white. You go to Zion, a world of real coordinates, embodied experiences and relationships, and it's polyglot. It's of color. It's highly intersubjective, deliberately by appearance, anyway. Yeah. So that struck me from where I was just starting my career when this came out. That struck me. So there it is. There's my confession to you for the origins of how I got to Greta and the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum, from being born nominally Jewish, but by accident and almost not.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that too, because you did talk about that some in the last episode. You talked about your family story, and I know we had talked off camera like a lot, like especially after our first interview, and you opened up and shared that information with me. But the forum from me to you, we want to say thank you, and we want to encourage mass audience and anyone else that's listening and watching, because we're really pushing the YouTube channel to subscribe for free. We don't want you to put your money where your mouth is. We want you to put that click subscribe button to open up that mind of yours. And so remember, you can't unthink free thought. This has been an unbelievable episode 71, and we can't wait to have you back on, Matt, probably in December or January after the new year. But we can't wait to talk to you down the road. And this will air at 2:30 Pacific, 4:30 Central, 5:30 Eastern. And beautiful people, enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk soon. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Kiko.
Thank you. We'll talk soon.
You bet.